Without any further hesitation, we will welcome Nick from the History Museum at the Castle in Appleton, and he has some pretty amazing subjects to talk about today. Welcome, Nick, please.
Thank you very much. First, I want to point out on our website some really important information. I work at the History Museum at the Castle, which is the home of the Outagamie County Historical Society. We're located kitty corner from Lawrence University, right on College Avenue in the heart of the city. And we have some really great exhibits right now. You can go there at any time and see our wonderful exhibit called AKA Houdini, about the life, a very brief life, of Harry Houdini in Appleton, Wisconsin. But we also have a great exhibit that we partnered with the Wisconsin Historical Museum that just opened up this last week. It's called Shifting Gears, a Cyclical History of Badger Bicycling. So it's a really fun exhibit, very hands-on. You get to actually hop on a bike and take a tour of a lot of our most famous state races and trails, and of course see everything from a velocipede to a high wheel to the latest Fatty Wampus. That's a fat bike that was made in Wisconsin, or designed in Wisconsin in 2015. So definitely come and check that out. But today we're going to be talking about some research that we completed. I might as well bring up the PowerPoint right away. Over the last, about 3 years, and it still is always ongoing. It's part of a traveling exhibit that we created called A Stone of Hope, Black Experiences in the Fox Cities. And we look at a lot of history that's been simply lost. As historians, we might call it marginalized history, history that has been intentionally pushed to the margins of our local history, and that would be African American history in the Fox Cities. When we started to research this topic of blacks who came to settle in northeast Wisconsin, we heard a lot of community members who came forward with recollections of Appleton being a sundown town. And so that was a lot of oral histories that we could build into this project. But what everyone had seemed to have forgotten was that before that period, back in the late 19th century, Appleton was actually home to a growing black community, as were nearby cities of Neenah, Waupaca even, Green Bay, and especially Oshkosh and Fond du Lac. But our research really narrowly focused primarily on Appleton, Wisconsin, and that'll be most of the research that I'll be sharing with you today. Of course, I want to point out our sponsors who helped make that traveling exhibit and all of this research and programming possible, as well as our great exhibit team. We had a wonderful partnership with African Heritage Incorporated, individuals who work at Lawrence University in their library, because that played such an important role in the research we were doing, and other community members who are very interested and committed to doing this research. But in order for us to start on this topic, we're going to go really far back, all the way back to when northeast Wisconsin was, even before we could call it northeast Wisconsin, back when the territory was held by the French. And occasionally we see small glimpses of blacks who were working in the fur trade. We know that there were 2 black men who operated a fur post just outside modern-day Marinette. We know that there were blacks, whites, and Native Americans, or American Indians, who were enslaved and working in the fur trade as well. We just get small glimpses of that history in our archives. But as Wisconsin finally became a state, we really want to point out that the state was settled with a lot of inequality right into its state constitution. And this is one glimpse from Article 3, excluding people of color from voting in any of our state or local elections. It was definitely an honor to be a member of your local militia. That was also barred in the state of Wisconsin. There are also laws that are either written or unwritten that would be under black codes that define black community members, what they could and could not do as participants of local government. So that's really important to point out. At the same time, while the state of Wisconsin is really growing into something and we're officially a state, there are blacks who are moving into northeast Wisconsin, settling the towns of Chilton, which was actually originally named Stantonville after a black community member who started that town, Freedom, of course. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the story of Freedom that was settled by an early black community member. But in Appleton, we start to see a growing black population right before the American Civil War. If you go into the census and occasionally in different newspaper sources, you'll find that there were blacks who were working in our local lumber industry. A man by the name of William Rollins, for instance, worked at our stave factory doing barrel making right in the industrial flats in the heart of Appleton. There were a few individuals around the time of the Civil War who were operating black-owned barber shops. So there's a wide variety of jobs that are available, very limited opportunities. They're going to primarily be typecast into very hard labor or doing things that might be more associated with the southern plantation, like domestic service. We know that there are young African-American women throughout northeast Wisconsin and Appleton who are working in homes, especially along the bluffs along the Fox River in Appleton. Many of those individuals are nameless. We just find advertisements, for instance, in black newspapers published in Milwaukee of requesting help or referring to black help at homes in Appleton, Wisconsin. But we really start to see a growth around the time of the end of the American Civil War. The American Civil War, of course, brought emancipation. There were new freedoms for blacks to move throughout the entire United States, especially into Wisconsin. We know that during the American Civil War, for instance, in Fond du Lac, there was a reverend who actually traveled with the Union Army, and as there were a large number of free blacks coming north to the Union lines, they were being boarded on a train and sent to Fond du Lac for resettlement. So there are large numbers of blacks starting to move into the area, large meaning in the low hundreds. But there also are other push and pull factors that are pretty interesting. For instance, this man in particular, this is Reverend William P. Newman, and we focus on his story in Ohio. As a reverend, he had his congregation, but also published the Provincial Freeman, which was a black abolitionist newspaper. He was a very outspoken critic of both the American Civil War and efforts with it, but also white abolitionists. It's important to remember that abolitionists, especially before the American Civil War, had a wide variety of opinions. In no way were they unified on exactly what emancipation might look like or what to do with freed slaves once the Civil War progressed. And he was very critical of that, so much so that he joined a growing number of black abolitionists who became frustrated with the white abolitionist movement. He moved to Haiti on the eve of the American Civil War. But after the war, his family actually purchased, not his family's congregation, was so grateful for his efforts in abolition that they purchased property in Appleton, Wisconsin. He never actually made it to Appleton, but people that he was related to, the Hollingsworth family, the Cleggett family, the Newman family, they all came into Appleton right after the American Civil War. And they're really kind of the first core of this growing black community within the city. And I do mean to say it was definitely growing, and it's really hard to document exactly how many blacks were living in Appleton after the American Civil War. The census often varies and is unreliable. Census enumerators were definitely interested in accounting for the families of black veterans. So individuals like Horace Artis, Joseph Elmore, who both enlisted to fight for the Union Army in the American Civil War, they and their families are tracked, but the census never really does a good job documenting how many people are coming in, of course, for seasonal summer labor. We know that there were blacks who were coming into Oshkosh, Neenah, Appleton each summer to help with moving lumber in and out of the area. But they're never, of course, recorded in the census because the census is just taking a very brief moment in time. We also know that black domestics are sort of haphazardly reported. Again, we see mentions in, for instance, a black newspaper that was published in Milwaukee in the 1890s called the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate. Occasionally, they mention, again, that there are domestic servants working in our area, but those domestic servants simply don't appear in our city directories or our census. We never really get a good number. But if we were to look at the families, the extended families, young black students at Lawrence University. We kind of put an estimate in Appleton of around maybe 30 individuals depending on the year. But again, it doesn't give us an idea of how many people are coming in each summer. The Wisconsin Weekly Advocate for Oshkosh estimated that in one summer there might have been 300 to 600 blacks who are working or living in Appleton and working in local industries. So that simply doesn't even appear in the Oshkosh census, even though Oshkosh had well over 100 blacks living there, according to the census at that time. But we do know a lot about the families who came into Appleton and what were some of those factors that brought them here. We have Horace Artis. Horace Artis, we know, was born into slavery just outside Norfolk, Virginia, in a small community known as Chuckatuck. And believe me, you can go to Google Maps and type in Chuckatuck, and it will show you roughly where that small crossroads was once located. We don't know a lot about his life in slavery, except that his obituary described him having a very cruel and tough, as they described in the obituary, tough master. So we get a small glimpse into his life. We also know that in 1861, just a few months before the American Civil War, he married a young woman named Bersina Corbin. So somehow they met. We're still trying to figure out where she was enslaved prior to their marriage, neither of which we know exactly what plantation they were on. But nonetheless, sometime around 1863 or early 1864, Horace Artis is either emancipated in 64 by the Union Army, or maybe he and his family flee earlier, because by about early summer 1864, they appear in Washington, D.C., where he enlists in the 31st United States Colored Troops. And he's actually in a regiment that marches with Abraham Lincoln into Richmond. He definitely was in a regiment that saw themselves as emancipators, because when they marched into Richmond, immediately on the spot, thousands and thousands of enslaved blacks were freed. His regiment is also there on the very last day of Robert E. Lee's army at the Battle of Appomattox. It's his regiment that finally stops Lee's army from escaping. So he has a very important role in our local and national military history. He eventually was sent down with many other black soldiers to the Rio Grande, where the Confederacy was trying to establish a new Confederate states in Mexico. And then eventually, he moves by the late 1860s with his family after the war into Outagamie County. And that's one of the fun stories about him. He works for the Henry Diener Farm. And this is one of those great moments doing research where you come across something really special. We have one farm ledger in our collection that is from that time period specifically. And the first entry is to Horace Artis. It's the Henry Diener Farm Ledger. So we know for sure that he was there during that period. On the other hand, we have Joseph Elmore. Joseph Elmore enlisted in the Union Army when he was actually, as he claims, below the age of enlistment. He was only 15 years old. He enlists in 1865 as the war is winding down. He trains in Milwaukee, and at some point he meets a young woman who he marries. Her name was Emma. Unsure about her first name. We don't have good records about her life before their marriage, but they both moved to Milwaukee as well. Horace Artis started as sort of a day laborer, working on a variety of different farms, doing a variety of jobs. For instance, if you remember Schlafer Hardware Company in downtown Appleton, that's a pretty famous hardware store in the city, or once was. He worked for them very briefly. Joseph Elmore fell into a job that he was extremely skilled at. He was a barber, and that is going to be one of the most common forms of small businesses that blacks could own in the Fox cities, because there were a lot of opportunities. There's one thing we really stress in our exhibit. There are opportunities for families like the Artises and the Elmores. Appleton at this time had integrated public schools. They had churches. In fact, there were black community members who helped found the First Baptist Church in downtown Appleton. There were many churches that were integrated. A lot of our big clubs and organizations were integrated, such as the Grand Army of the Republic. We have the King's Home very nearby. In Appleton, some of the people who helped found the King's Home had an integrated Grand Army of the Republic chapter. And some of them were also Masons. We don't know yet if there was what was called a Prince Hall Lodge, Masonic lodge locally, which was just for African Americans. But nonetheless, it looks like our Masonic lodges may have even been integrated because Joseph Elmore was a member. So while there are some opportunities like that, better opportunities that you might have found, say for instance, south of the Ohio River, those opportunities are very limited because jobs are going to basically for African Americans be stereotyped. It's going to be jobs that reflected plantation work. But that's not to say that they were not extremely successful business people. Joseph Elmore, for instance, if you're familiar with downtown Appleton, this building is now the Zilke building. It's one of our only two kind of skyscrapers in our city. This is the building that preceded that. And his barbershop is right where these red awnings were, right next to City Hall. His barbershop was extremely successful, so much so that when he passed away, he had a front page obituary that described him as the Dean of Barbers in the city. We also believe that he was the one who was supplying all the local news and gossip about Appleton's black community to the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate. And he even mentions in one instance in the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate that he had many notable white politicians who were among his clients, and he also tried to enlist them to sign up for the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate. So even though he doesn't come out and say it, he's very clearly politically savvy and wanting to get issues that were important to Appleton's black community in the hands of these politicians. And there were women, too, who had extremely important roles. That's Joseph Elmore's wife, Emma Elmore. We don't get a lot of glimpses into her life except in the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate. She very clearly is part of a welcoming committee. Whenever there's a new black community member moving into Appleton, she's usually hosting a party for them to kind of welcome them. She also was sort of the organizer of what was called as Appleton's Black Aristocracy. It also included African Americans from Wapaka and Neenah. They would come to Appleton for larger celebrations. Their big kind of connector was that they all had at least one Civil War veteran in the family. And then also I mentioned earlier Reverend William P. Newman. His family really came and settled in Appleton's 3rd Ward. And so some of his relatives, such as the Hollingsworth family, Emma Hollingsworth operated a hair goods store. She also was kind of like a social worker in Appleton during that time period. She was the matron of the Appleton's Children's Home. So she certainly played a very important role in Appleton as well. And Lawrence University, too, played a really important part in this early sort of community building for African Americans. Lucretia Newman Coleman, of course, was related again to Reverend William P. Newman. She was a student in the 1870s at Lawrence University. She was an extremely dynamic student. You can go on to Google Books, and when you type in her name, you'll find a book published in the 1890s that was identifying the most important black women writers of that decade. And she was identified in that. And even publications more recently in the 1990s, for instance, she's also with very large biographies talking about her importance in black women's history. So she's a very crucial player in this story. Another individual who attended Lawrence University is a young man named Claude Paris, also an extremely dynamic student. He seems to pop up in most clubs at Lawrence University. He's always appearing. He was definitely a very successful football and basketball player. He appears front and center in both of their group portraits in the yearbook. But we see him in other organizations such as the newspaper. Here's Claude right here. He is a Wapakan. His father was James Monroe Paris, who owned a barber shop in downtown Wapaka, and was the first, that we've been able to find, the first black elected official in northeast Wisconsin. And it would be about 100 years until that happens again. So I really encourage the city of Wapaka to delve into that history a little bit further and definitely celebrate his important legacy. So there's a growing black community in Appleton. Again, we have black community members working in a wide variety of jobs. I should say with barbers, when you go to look at and insurance claims after fires. Obviously, if our industry in northeast Wisconsin is based on wood, there's going to be a lot of bad fires. And that's certainly the case in cities like Oshkosh and De Pere. And an individual who's working on those histories has mentioned that black barber shops are some of the most successful ranked businesses with major insurance claims, just demonstrating how dynamic of business leaders they were. We also had young black women who were working as teachers in things like the Neenah School District and also Appleton. So there's just a wide variety of jobs. There certainly are opportunities that are available. But the North, certainly, and the upper Midwest for sure, was not immune to extremely rapidly changing politics throughout the United States. We think of things like Jim Crow laws as being a Southern problem, or racism being a Southern problem during that time period. But after the Civil War, the radical Republicans and people who are a little more sympathetic towards equality are voted out of office and very quickly marginalized. So after the Civil War, they passed a lot of civil rights legislation that we associate with the 1960s, but these things were already passed and real things after the American Civil War. But being politically marginalized, Southern Democrats were able to vote out a lot of that legislation, and it all peels back into the Jim Crow, separate but equal policies, and just really marginalizes African Americans with major threats of violence, mass killings throughout the United States. And so that's not just isolated to the South. That does come up into the North as well. It just looks a little bit different. And even if it is in the South written by law, in the North it's still happening and being chosen to be put into play, often not written into law, but very much by the choosing of citizens in the vast majority of communities throughout the Midwest. So what did that look like in Appleton? That was one of the things we really wanted to delve into our research. We wanted to figure out exactly what was happening in our city. And so that's what we first really invested a lot of our time into documenting. Because it's one thing for people in oral histories to say Appleton was a sundown town, but as a good historian, we have to take that a step further. We need to find it written in the sources, in their own words, as close to that time period and events as we can. That's doing good research. And it wasn't very hard to find a lot of that documentation. In 1915, that seems to be a pretty important year. Either the newspapers are just starting to really pay attention to things that were happening in the city. This is sort of after Jim Crow, definitely after Jim Crow policies or laws are set throughout the South, and a little bit later than what we see for this type of activity in the North. But one of the things we can point to right away is that the police department had participation in things that were happening. And we get that in a glimpse of 1915, May 17th, in the Appleton Evening President. There was an article that ran with the title, Appleton No City for Colored Folks. They interviewed a young black bricklayer who came into Appleton looking for work. He described being met by the police in a patrol wagon, which apparently was frequently parked at Appleton's main railroad junction just south of town, where he was immediately put into the wagon on suspicion of being a vagrant. He was taken to jail. On the way there, young children came out of their homes and yelled racial slurs at him while he was paraded through the city. And the next morning, he was told to get out of town. So that's just one little glimpse. We did work a lot with the Appleton Police Department on this research, and they have one of the most amazing pieces of documentation in doing any type of research. Any project I do, I'm going to be going to look at this. But they have their arrest ledgers going all the way back to the late 1870s. So going through page by page, you kind of get an idea of what was happening. And very loosely, there's a vagrancy law. There is no sundown law for Appleton, Wisconsin. Many people have looked for that all the way back to, we can document people looking for that all the way back to the 1940s. And there wasn't a law, but there's ways that other laws could be applied. And one's a vagrancy law. That's very common throughout the Midwest for police departments to use, and cities to use a vagrancy law that was up to the police officer to try and guess whether or not somebody actually had residency in the city. It was used to keep out labor union organizers, Eastern and Southern Europeans who were typecast into very hard work, who supposedly had ties to communism, African Americans, people of color. That vagrancy law throughout the Midwest applies to keeping the undesirables out, according to the city at that time. So how did that work in Appleton? Horace Artis, our Civil War veteran who stopped Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse, he was arrested over Christmas in 1885, even though we could go to a city directory within 10 years before that and just open up to the Artis family name and see that he lived in the city of Appleton. People clearly knew him in Appleton, but he was arrested under this vagrancy law and was taken to jail for about 25 days until some of his family friends could come and let him go. Now, there are other ways, too, that the police are sort of harassing. It's not just this vagrancy law. Every single black family that I have mentioned so far had at least one family member or one black employee that worked for them who was arrested at least once or fined, just constant little harassment. So that's certainly something that's at play in the city of Appleton. We also know, and this is kind of common with cities, not kind of, very common with cities that are sundown towns, is some sort of an effort to prohibit who can spend the night in Appleton. And that was one story we heard frequently in these oral histories and recollections, was that African Americans could not stay at our downtown hotel. And again, in 1915, again, this might just be when the newspapers started to pay more attention to this happening. In 1915, the Tuskegee Singers from the Tuskegee Institute run a northern tour trying to raise funds for the Institute. They came to Appleton, Wisconsin for a performance. That evening, they went to downtown Appleton to at least 3 hotels to try and find a place to stay. And in every instance, they were turned away because they were black. And it just appeared in our local newspapers. I found it as far away as Rhinelander being reported this way. And that becomes a pretty constant trend. One of the more interesting stories that I kept hearing while we started talking about this project was that Marian Anderson, the very famous soprano in 1941, was going to come to Appleton to sing, and she wasn't allowed to spend the night because she was black. Well, digging into these research, actually at our Congregational church, their reverend at the time kept wonderful records of things happening in the city every single day and commented on that. She was at the Conway Hotel. She actually did spend the night there, even though we know the Conway was a very sympathetic hotel to segregation. George Wallace launched his presidential campaign there, for instance. But she spent the night there, but they did not want her to be seen in public, so she was forced to eat in her room and not in the hotel's restaurant. There also, throughout the entire United States, is a growing popular culture movement that's playing up on a lot of the sort of racism to reinforce what people are doing throughout the United States. If you're going to be racist and keep blacks out of your communities, popular culture was really trying to reinforce blacks as being untrustworthy, people who steal, violent, uneducated, and popular culture really defines that with minstrel shows. They had been popular for a very long time, but by that 1890s, early 1900s, they are a massive rage throughout the Midwest. Things like the Moose Lodge and churches are using minstrel shows for fundraisers for their nonprofits. Lawrence University, as late as 1953, at their convocation, had blackface minstrel show performances. And as theater becomes more sophisticated with motion pictures, we also see that things like Birth of the Nation played for extended periods in Appleton. The Klansman actually predated that. It was a very popular theater performance in Appleton. So popular culture is sort of reinforcing what all of this legislation and racism that's sweeping the United States was a part of. Another thing that we see, and this is very common, I bet you can even find this in Wapaka. If you go to property deeds, early property deeds, especially those that were rewritten, say, in the 1910s to 1930s, there will be language inserted into them that prohibit blacks from owning that property once it was sold. And that's very common to find in Appleton. Riverview Golf Course, for instance, or Golf Club had that in their property And it was brought back to public attention when it was resold just a few years ago. So in 1916, even though this headline isn't entirely true, the Oshkosh Northwestern said that Appleton lost its only Negro. All of those early black community members who came and settled in Appleton had passed away by that point. Most of them are actually buried at Riverside Cemetery in Appleton, kind of scattered throughout the part of the cemetery that was what would be the word, erected, I guess, during that time period. So their children all moved out of the city, and that's one of our new projects. We're trying to trace where the artists, Oliver artists, Nettie artists, what happened to them. We know that they scatter primarily to Minneapolis, Milwaukee, and even some places in the South. So things change very, very quickly in Appleton. And we want to point out, too, that even though Appleton in the census eventually drops to 0 blacks living in the city, there were blacks who came very frequently into Appleton, almost every single summer starting around World War II. For instance, there were Jamaican migrant workers who would come to the city every single year, and we're just starting to dig into their research, too. When they came to Wisconsin, for instance, they would follow a harvest schedule that would have them maybe 1 week canning peas, a couple months later up in Door County for the cherry harvest. And a lot of the stories, the oral histories that have grown about sundown towns in this part of Wisconsin really come from their experiences. For instance, in Door County in the resort region, when they would go up there to do the cherry harvest, a lot of the resorts would put up signs in their windows that prohibited blacks from going into restaurants or hotels. In Appleton, one of the most common stories is that at the end of the workday or the start of the workday, there would be a siren that would go off at the canning plant, which was Furman Canning Company, later Stokely, and the black Jamaican migrant workers had to exit off the streets and go report for work or for bed. Another really important part that kind of plays into this history is kind of a blame that the KKK was behind all of this. And we definitely also want to make sure people know that that's not true, even though the Klan did have a presence locally. There are at least 2 big Klan periods that we have focused on in this exhibit. There's one right after the American Civil War, which is Southern-based. It's the first Ku Klux Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest, extremely violent Klan trying to basically end any of the authority and power that blacks politically achieved after the American Civil War. Very strong threats of violence and death. We do know that that first Klan at least came to Appleton and tried to recruit once right after the Civil War. They came to a circus where they tried to enlist people from Appleton from joining. Never really caught on. That first Klan definitely catches on in the South, kind of disappears, never really catches on in the North, though. It's not until the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan really rises again. The second Klan was a Midwest-based organization. They were headquartered in Indiana. Many Indiana towns claimed to be 100% white, 100% Klan. It was a Protestant organization, so they were targeting not just African Americans, but also Catholics, Jews. And in Appleton and the Fox Cities, around 1922, we start to see a growing Klan presence. We know that they were recruiting, at least in 1924, in Wapaka. They were very strong in Oshkosh and Neenah. They were also strong in Appleton, on Strobe Island, just south of the city. That was their main parade ground. They really tried to intimidate downtown businesses, some of which were Catholic and Jewish-owned, with cross burning that occurred, and if I recall correctly, it was 1924. They lit 3 crosses right down the center of College Avenue, and then to intimidate the whole Fox Cities and really demonstrate that they were a powerful organization. On one evening, they lit a massive cross right at the northern tip of Lake Winnebago with the goal of having it reflect all the way down the lakes, and individuals down in Fond du Lac could see this growing Klan presence, which some newspapers around the lake do report seeing it that evening. But probably because they were targeting Catholics and Jews, there were no African Americans really living in Appleton at that time period, so they were definitely here to keep Appleton white, but picking on Catholics in Northeast Wisconsin is going to be pretty tough to do, and so they're politically marginalized. But they are something that we really want to learn a little bit more and understand about. But they are not, for sure, the individuals who, they may be some of the same individuals who are responsible for this sundown town custom in the city, but they are not solely to blame. It all predates them. So what is a sundown town like? And I want to make sure that the one description I saw for the today's event talks a little bit about it having, describes it first off as a law. It also describes it of having to have some sort of a sign, which neither of which are absolutely true whatsoever. We can't document in hard, concrete evidence a sign that says African Americans have to leave by sundown anywhere in Northeast Wisconsin. There's some rumors and recollections of, say, Manitowoc. We've even looked there, haven't been able to find that in the newspaper. So we have to get the idea of a sign enforcing this policy out of our minds, although that is occasionally the case throughout the upper Midwest. Another thing that some folks automatically have associated with something that has to happen in a sundown town is a siren. We do know at Stokely, Jamaican migrant workers are being called back and forth to the factory with a siren. And we know that throughout the Midwest, sometimes a siren meant that African Americans had to leave the city at sundown. But again, in Northeast Wisconsin, haven't been able to find that concrete piece of documentation that says that was absolutely true anywhere in our area. So in Appleton, it is a custom. It's not a law. It's something that individuals are choosing to enforce themselves. And so the first time we find any sort of evidence of people worried about Appleton being a sundown town was in the 1940s. In 1947, the Congregationalist Churches of Wisconsin were going to hold a conference in Appleton. And our local Congregationalists, the hosts, were very worried that black Congregationalists would not be able to spend the night because it was a sundown town. And so they actually brought in the state of Wisconsin to go through all of the city's laws, open up all of their books, and they didn't find any evidence. So we learned that it's not a law, it's not something that's written, but enough people believed it, followed it, and put in place that the whole Congregational Church in Appleton was worried that black Congregationalists would not be able to spend the night in the city. And we see that happening again. There's at least one other instance where the state comes in to research this specifically. In the early 1950s, the state of Wisconsin also was looking at discrimination practices for employers throughout the state of Wisconsin. They were primarily worried about wounded World War II veterans coming in and trying to find work after the war. So they sent a young woman out to interview factory owners all over Wisconsin, including Appleton. And luckily, those files still exist, her raw notes with the interviews. And that gives us some glimpses as well. Factory owners, for instance, in Appleton, would point out that maybe at one time they were officers of all black regiments during World War II, which is pretty interesting. But one individual specifically from a local machine company said that blacks could not be hired by local factories because they had to leave by sundown. And he actually describes it in the notes as it being an unwritten law that prevents them from spending the night. So that's another glimpse of this coming through as written evidence. The best piece of evidence, though, of what life is like in a sundown town comes from a very young Lawrence student who in the early 1950s, her name was Rosalie Keller, decided to, as a project for the Laurentian newspaper, to cold call area businesses. She was a Southerner, so perhaps she had a Southern draw. She was hoping that she would get their unfiltered opinions. In some instances, as she reported, the businesses didn't even realize that she was white. But she wanted to get their unfiltered opinions. So places like the Conway Hotel responded to her by saying, absolutely, blacks cannot spend the night at their hotel. Other places like Jake Skull's Colonial Wonder Bar, right on the Appleton-Menasha border, they said, they had a very Southern Jim Crow type policy at their restaurant that black businessmen could eat at the restaurant, but they had to come to the back kitchen door, order there, and eat in the kitchen, and not go out into the public areas. They said anyone who wasn't a business person who wanted to eat there could only order at the back kitchen door, but had to eat outside. La Villa Restaurant, located in downtown Appleton, said that they would only serve respectable-looking blacks because they have black performers coming into the city occasionally. So her study, and she talks to maybe 20, 30 different establishments, gives us at least sort of how this was applied. Oddly enough, when she talks to everyone, they don't mention Sundown Town at all. So it's just kind of an example of this racism and how individual businesses are making Appleton an unwelcoming place for African Americans. So through all this period, one of the things that we've really tried to document, because so many people were pushing us to do this, was when does Appleton not become a sundown town? What are the events that sort of caused this to happen? And we looked in 1961. That's a really big period, specifically May 1961. We have a very famous civil rights activist from Appleton named Jim Zwerg, who went to school in Beloit and then eventually spent time studying at Fisk in Nashville. And he became involved with the Freedom Riders, and he was very publicly beaten in early May, and his bloody face and body appeared in a wide variety of magazines. It was circulated all over the United States. And when news of that came back to Appleton, even though people certainly did not agree on the direction for the city and whether or not it should really be a place that strives for equality, there at least was a conversation that started in the letters to the editor. And there was clearly a conversation happening in the community, which is a very important first step. At the end of the week, after he was very publicly beaten, the events came home to Appleton. There was a black baseball team from Des Moines came to play our local baseball team at the end of their series. They went out on College Avenue. Both teams actually went out on College Avenue to have a few beers to celebrate the end of a very hard-fought series. And when they went into a bar called Carl's Tap, the owner jumped up from behind the bar and threatened them to leave because they were black. And that event in particular was spread throughout in the newspapers throughout Northeast Wisconsin, even made it in one of the most important civil rights newspapers during that era, the Chicago Defender, and that's the headline from it, 7 ball players meet Jim Crow in Wisconsin. And it's that event as well where people start talking about racial inequality in the city, and really talking specifically about this long legacy of it being, for many decades, being a city only for whites. And occasionally those letters to the editor do openly say that Appleton was a sundown town, and now it's time to try and make those changes. So we see little pieces of legislation coming forward within the city, and then of course national legislation that touched on the city, like the open housing ordinances. So it's a very important period. And another one, which we won't get into today, which is, I think, very, very important, something that's completely forgotten in Appleton as well, except for black students who attended Lawrence during this period and some white students, is that in the late 1960s, Lawrence University was very much a part of the civil rights movement. Black and white students protested often and tried to work with the chancellor to really force him to start making the campus a much more welcoming place. So we see black students returning to Lawrence University in the mid-1960s. But of course, legislation is one thing. There certainly is, and still today, a lot of changes that will always need to be made. So that's Appleton in a nutshell. And all of the research that we had uncovered on Appleton as a sundown town, which is certainly important to recognize, but it's also equally important to finally bring those early community members out from the margins of history and bring them into the forefront. It's now impossible, in my opinion, to do Civil War history in Appleton and leave out Horace Ardis, who was literally fighting for his freedom and the freedom of others, and who was there at Appomattox Courthouse to force Robert E. Lee's surrender. That's a really powerful story that's just been completely lost to our history. So hopefully this project isn't something that is just about this one exhibit that we developed. We hope that anyone doing local history has to think about all of these different angles and how and why black history matters to Appleton as we create new books and exhibits and other projects as well. Does anyone have any questions? I know I covered a whole lot. Yeah?
Did this racism, was this applied against the Native Americans as well?
Yeah, you know, it's certainly not coincidental that the Oneida Reservation is miles from Appleton. And I would say, I'm trying to think when the last mention of Oneidas in Appleton occurs, and it's, boy, I forget the exact decade, but it describes the Oneida as being homeless and destitute and starving, so it's during that allotment period at least in Appleton, so it's certainly applied. The vagrancy laws and keeping people out, that's applied universally to anyone who's deemed by the city to be undesirable. So, I mean, certainly, I would love to see an exact reference to that to the Oneida during this period. Would be pretty interesting. We do know they get arrested occasionally for vagrancy. They're in the vagrancy books as well. Yeah.
You touched on their descendants. Are there any descendants that you know of in Appleton right now?
Not in Appleton, and that was one of the challenges. So when we do any sort of history that involves genealogy, generally we can find family members, but because there's an early black community and a long period where they moved elsewhere, there's no connection, there's no consistency over generations of families that live there. So nobody living in Appleton can we trace back to that early family, except we have worked very carefully with several black churches in the Norfolk area. Horace Artis is a very common last name in that area, but we cannot identify anyone who may be related to Horace in particular. But clearly it's still a very popular last name in that area. Yeah?
What is the population distribution of Appleton currently?
Currently, I just heard it, geez, I just heard it on Friday. I got to get what the exact number is. I know we're over 1,000. I want to say, without giving you exact number, somewhere near 1,500 African Americans who are living in Appleton today. That's a growing population very, very quickly. I want to say about a decade ago, it might have been around less than 500, but more than 300 individuals. So it's growing very, very quickly. So it's very important, especially as schools like Columbus School and Appleton overall are very, very diverse and growing very quickly with minority students, that we have more names, more heroes and sheroes that look like them and have long histories in Appleton be brought to the forefront. That it's not just white community members, which we certainly need to research and learn as well, but young black students can now point to Horace Artis or Lucretia Newman Coleman as being incredibly important players in our local history. Yeah?
Do you have any opinions on both that?
I don't. I haven't looked in extreme depth on that. And that would be pretty interesting. I'm sure it's not just the Paris family in the city at all. Has anyone researched the Paris family? No? Yeah?
There are documents with the Historical Society that I had you try to contact you on that.
And I did, yeah. We did talk quite a bit. There is, without going into a lot of detail, because I don't know the direction of his project, but there is a PhD candidate at UW-Mac. I think he does have his PhD now, but he's working on kind of a broader statewide history and is very interested and is learning a lot about the Paris family. I do encourage you to go to the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate. It is digitized, and it's available in a couple different databases. And when you type in the word Paris or artist or your community, you'll learn all sorts of things you never knew about Wapaka. And I often find that the black press out of Milwaukee is often doing a much better job on minority populations in those cities entirely. I would go for the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate as being one of the best and most honest sources about local Jewish history, talking about causes of chain migration to Appleton, a little more specific on the businesses that they're starting in the city. So that source, the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate, is just a gold mine doing a wide variety of topics in Northeast Wisconsin. Yeah?
You were talking about migrant workers.
Yep.
As I was growing up in Wisconsin, it was the Hispanic Latino community that was primarily the migrant workforce. Did you bump into any like sundown type laws regarding Hispanic?
I'm sure they faced a lot of discrimination. I'm sure, but I haven't quite dug into their story, only because in Madison, it's just waiting for someone to write an amazing book. Is it called the College of Agriculture? I forget what it's specifically called at UW-Madison, but their library has just piles of records on this migrant program. It's just amazing. So I had to pick and choose what I was looking for very quickly, particularly as it played to this topic. But boy, someone could go back and just find incredible information. I mean, the records will go specifically down to anything happening in Wapaka in the area. Just fascinating stuff.
Well, recently, Wisconsin and Madison in specific have dealt with English language learners and, you know, the Hispanic community and bilingual students, and they're dealing with, you know, trying to have the education system keep up with the growing migrant and Latino communities.
Yeah, I know that was definitely a thing in Appleton. Occasionally we'll find each summer, as a lot of the same families would return every summer, there were programs, for instance, through Lawrence University, area churches, and even, I recall, libraries working on English language programs and those sort of things, all the way back to the 1960s, at least with the research I've done, and I'm sure earlier than that, too. Any other questions? I gave you a very quick overview, so even on the biographies. It's just amazing what can we pull forward. When we started doing this project, we actually heard from individuals who said we weren't going to find anything, that wasn't necessarily a waste of time because people were very interested in this topic, but that our research was going to be pretty short-lived. And as we start digging, and even today, as more stuff becomes digitized and more records come forward, it's almost impossible to keep up with. When you're doing genealogy, as I'm sure a lot of you are genealogists, you know, when you start digging to your family and you find one or two clues and that river just pours forward with information, well, that happened with every one of the families that we were researching. You just had to figure out where to find those sources. For doing African American history, and I would definitely urge Wapaka to get this for James Monroe Paris. I'm sure he was a Civil War veteran. I'd be surprised if he wasn't. So many black barbers in northeast Wisconsin were. When doing kind of getting your foot on the iceberg, I guess, and not knowing what might be beneath it, the important part to get is their military records, both their individual service records, but most importantly, their pension application. Because at the start of the pension application, you have to write a long narrative, often describing where you came to be, where you applied for your application. So for Horace Artis, that's about 4 pages of personal testimony, talking about his service in Texas, how he came to Appleton, Wisconsin, and the jobs that he held within the city. Same thing happens for the Cleggett family, and we're waiting to get Joseph Elmore's application if he did, in fact, apply. So James Monroe Paris, I would suspect he was a Civil War veteran. It'd be worth finding out. And if he is, that pension application is going to teach you a lot about Wapaka, I would suspect. It's expensive. It's, I think, are like $60 or $80 to get, but for Horace Artis, that was well over 100 pages of information. Yep.
I grew up in Appleton, and I really liked a lot of your comments, and it was just like reminding me of certain things that happened in Appleton. My mom and dad both graduated from Lawrence College. My grandfather lived across the street from Columbus School.
Oh, yeah.
And my mother went to school there, and she used to run home at recess for a cookie or something, and the teachers would scold her because she might have gotten run over by a horse. And the other were rehabbing it, and it was a bed and breakfast that became a bed and breakfast, and they took off the linoleum, and here was a trap door, which I didn't even know was there.
Yeah.
And I talked to a local historian, Wendell Nelson, and he told me that we would never know whether that was an underground railroad, because of course it wouldn't be in writing anywhere.
Sure.
And I just enjoyed your talk so much. I've gone to the castle with my granddaughter, and when she was like 5 or 4, and she went into that Houdini room,
Yeah.
and she just loved playing with a padlock.
Oh, yeah.
Touching how cold the water was when he jumped in the river, and
Yeah.
I just enjoyed your talk a lot.
You bring up the Underground Railroad, which is certainly an interesting part, and there's kind of a separation of conversations that are happening. It's starting to trickle down to communities, but academic historians have been suspicious about what that really means, and for especially white abolitionists and their involvement. And essentially, abolitionists, like I said before, come from a wide variety of different beliefs, many of which were in fact racist by today's lens. And for instance, even in Appleton, we look at a lot of our abolitionists, and they're very much and very clearly stating that they are against slavery, but for instance, do not want blacks moving to the community after the Civil War. A lot of them were involved in, you've heard of it roughly described as a recolonization of Africa movement. That's very common, moving blacks who escaped to Canada as quickly as possible, certainly to evade slave catchers, but also with the very real notion of not letting blacks live locally. So it's pretty complicated. There's a lot of historians, I shouldn't say a lot, but at least a few historians who are looking even at some of Wisconsin's most held and shared stories of the Underground Railroad and kind of putting a little different lens. And it's so especially true because as we do this research, we're finding new things all the time. The digitization of old newspapers and historical sources has just completely changed so much what we know about history. So with a lot of Underground Railroad stories, we're looking at it with a little bit different focus, or at the very least, putting the focus back on, less on the white abolitionists, but more on blacks who took the risk to escape for freedom, and in many cases tried to raise funds to purchase their family back. So there's a whole change in what we know about that happening.
I have a comment to make. My interest in Sundown Towns started when the book was written, and I heard the author.
Yeah.
But the history is important.
Yeah.
But we must also, or I do, know that that history is still moving, and it hasn't gotten to a point where it's completely been erased, the racism.
Mm-hmm.
I go to church in Appleton, and am involved in Appleton. And our church had a Black Lives Matter sign up, and it was defaced. That has not been, I don't think, we were away when it happened, so I don't know if it was in the newspaper, but.
I think it barely made I might be thinking about social media and seeing it there, but I'm not sure it made the Post-Press or
And I
not.
don't think it's a newspaper. But another thing that I'm very aware of, and I don't know that everybody knows, is that the police chief wrote a letter or an article and insinuated, or it seemed insinuated, that Black Lives Matter was a violent group. And it really did hurt the African American population in Appleton. And so there's been a lot of work to try to address that and change the culture, attitude. So I don't know if everybody's aware of that, but very much involved with that, and very concerning to me. So just the history, and looking back, we also have to take that history and move it forward and look at where we are as white people. And that's what I want to say.
Yeah, those are great comments. Yeah.
Let's give Nick Hoffman a hand. We're definitely going to have to have him back because it sounds like he has great stories to tell us, and I invite all of you to go to the History Museum at the Castle, and it's open Tuesday through
Sunday, 11 to 4.